Travel trailers are portable living spaces that can be towed by vehicles, providing a convenient way for people to explore the outdoors while still enjoying many of the comforts of home. They come in various sizes and styles, from compact models that are easy to maneuver to larger units with multiple amenities. They've gotten really popular recently due to the growing interest in outdoor recreation and the desire for flexible travel options. Travel trailers allow you to take off on an adventure without the need for hotel accommodations, offering a sense of freedom and a way to connect with nature. Well, I decided to try my hand at building a trailer. And actually, I succeeded. And everyone seems to like it. So I thought I'd make a video about how I made it. Previously, I'd made a treehouse and a camping box, both of which I designed in the computer. So I decided to do the same for this project. Both my father and brother are carpenters, and I'd done construction as a kid and as a teenager on various forts and clubhouses. I really don't like hammers and nails, and working with my father, I discovered the open blade of the table saw and skill saw scared the hell out of me. I saw a lot of people using a new way of construction and employed it on my camping box. The use of a drill and screw for joining, and to cut wood, a chop saw. It seemed a much more precise way of construction. So since I was successful with it on my camping box, I decided to see if I could use the same technique for the trailer. The aesthetic I wanted to use was an old-timey feel. I'm also a big Tolkien fan. I had seen many a project made with plywood and felt it was not a good aesthetic. So I set out to only use boards or planks because, one, it would give the look of before plywood was invented, but also, two, I could easily cut it on the chop saw. And three, if I made the trailer out of pine, one of the lightest woods, it would not be too heavy. My plan was to buy a metal frame from Northern Tool or Harbor Freight and build upon that. Well, my dad had one he had bought and offered it to me. So, in late September of 2019, my dad gave me his trailer. I drove it home and parked it outside my house. I began the design of my trailer using the animation program Blender. Not the usual program to choose for architectural work, but I had familiarized myself with it and thought it would work. It took me way too long to figure out how I was going to translate the computer world to the real world in terms of measurements. But suddenly I hit upon the simple idea of making a unit in Blender that corresponds to the grid in the program to equal 1 inch. It would have been easier if we used the metric system here in America, because then the computer and my measuring tools would all be base 10. But I just took decimals of a Blender's unit and figured the fraction of an inch to the closest 1/16, and this pretty much worked. By November, I was showing off pictures of my design. I was looking at the construction like making a deck or a fence. I had settled on a rounded motif that would resemble a hobbit house. Since it's like a miniature living space, I thought this was a good fit. The classic teardrop trailer, of course, was my starting base. I decided that, like a teardrop trailer, the function would mostly be a bed to sleep in while camping and traveling. Most teardrops have a kitchen in the back. I wanted to avoid the claustrophobic conditions I saw with teardrops, so I designed double doors in the back to provide a view while lying in the trailer. I had visions of a roof like a roll-up desk that could be pulled back to reveal even more of a view, but gave up on those ideas as it seemed too unworkable. On December 11th, 2019, my dad passed on. The whole family had gathered, and I got this last picture of him where you can see his pointy ear. It's possible I might be part Elven, but I think he was a very good carpenter. And it's possible that part of the reason the trailer came out so well was because carpentry runs in our family. But it was then I decided that the trailer would be a homage to him. He had been an active part of the planning process up to that point. It was a great reason to communicate, which had always been an issue with us. And he always had given me advice about how to make it stronger and the best way to construct the trailer. Well, I didn't dive into construction immediately. In fact, I didn't order wood until the middle of the summer. I used Ashby Lumber, a firm in Berkeley, which I was hoping would give me some pretty good wood. I didn't actually pick it up until October 2nd, and construction didn't start until November. It was not a rushed process, as you will see. I had several breaks of time during construction. In the meantime, I received 2 octagonal windows from Who's. Well, I'd pulled the trigger financially, so I needed to do something. The first thing to build was to frame the floor. I decided on splitting it into 2 levels. There would be a lower back level and a higher level, which the bed would sit on. This would give the feel that you're at the height of a normal bed when sitting on the mattress, looking out the back door. I thought having a lower level at the primary entrance next to the back doors would also keep dirt from getting on the bed. The floor framing was achieved with Douglas fir 2x4, which I was afraid to use at first because of their weight. By turning the 2x4s at the entrance flat, I was able to make different heights for the 2 levels and create more structural integrity where people would stand. Next, I built the steps for the porch for the round door. I'll get into the thought process for the porch later, but this was the first Facebook post I made about the trailer. And I called it my first step to a bigger project. I got the wood for the steps from someone around the corner who left an IKEA bed out for people to take for free. I found the pine wood IKEA uses for its products to be the kind of light wood I wanted to use for building the trailer, so it was also a good fit. After this, I framed the back wall using 2x4s. This was a purposeful design choice. I was really worried about the back wall parallelogramming, collapsing because of the lack of diagonal support. So I made it a little beefier than the rest of the trailer. Part of that meant using metal joiners where the back walls meet the floor. The whole thing consisted of a square frame and cross posts where the double doors would be. By December, I was laying down the floorboards. In this picture, you can see my first fancy cuts. I had to use a handsaw to make the notch cut in the supporting posts for the door, and use a chisel to make room for the joiner on the last floorboards. My brother said my dad would be proud that I centered my floorboards in the middle and worked my way to the end so that the floor would be symmetrical instead of starting on one end and ending with a partial board on the other. For the next step, I waterproofed the underside of the trailer. I used rubber paint on both the upper and lower levels on the sides facing the road to protect from splashing. Next, using metal joiners and bolts, I secured the floor to the trailer. Here I want to point out that construction like this is really a 3-part process. First part is to design what you want to build, which I was doing in the computer. This part has the advantage in that it has none of the limitations of physics. You can build things that are very hard to build in the real world. The second part is recreating your design in the real world, where there is physics that might give you problems. A lot of this has to do with the order that you build things. The third part would be the actual building or construction. So at this point, I realized to make the building process the most workable, I'd have to build the porch before making the walls. The idea of the porch was that when entering the side door, you would be above the mattress and not have to climb on top of it. Also, I felt that having a door in the middle of a wall without a porch was a bad aesthetic. Framing and laying down floorboards is a pretty straightforward process, but building a cantilevered porch requires a bit more finesse. I developed a technique at this point which I employed over and over again, a process for taking the complicated shapes I had come up with in the computer and rendering them in actual wood. In my research, I discovered there were devices called CNC machines, which are essentially computer-controlled routers that would have easily done the trick. However, they are cost prohibitive. Instead, I devised a process of projecting the shapes onto the wall, tracing the outline of the shape onto the board, and then cutting it with the jigsaw. The advantage of this technique is that you are utilizing polygons in your computer animation program. The models are composed of all straight lines. There are no curved lines. The models appear curved, but they are not. So you only have to cut straight lines with the jigsaw, and I find that easier. Here's the first board I cut using this process for the porch. With trial and error, I was able to make sure that my projection was to scale, with one unit measuring 1 inch. I did this by creating both a virtual ruler and a virtual yardstick. And with this process, I was able to finish the porch, and it came out pretty good. I was surprised. It was at this point I started to think, maybe I can do this, but still had a lot of doubts. In this picture, you can also see the cross bracing I installed to support the back wall, which I was very concerned would deform with the weight of the doors on it. With the floor pretty much wrapped up, it was time to move on to the next step. As I mentioned earlier, much of the design inspiration for the trailer was from Tolkien. If you look at Tolkien, I think there's a lot of influence in his work, not from the Middle Ages, but really from the 1800s. So I looked to Victorian architecture for inspiration too. In Victorian homes, it's common to find wainscoting. When I was younger, I lived in a railroad worker's house, which consisted of 4 10-by-10 rooms. In the living room, it had what was called a picture rail, because it was about 5 feet above the floor. I really liked that architectural feature because it felt old-timey to me. And I also thought having a railing that wraps around the bed would be handy to rest things on while camping. And finally, I thought the wainscoting would add strength to the walls and make the trailer less top-heavy to prevent it from falling over in the wind. The design of the wainscoting is very close to just a railing around the floor, as you can see here in an early version of the design. I spaced the wainscoting boards gradually closer together as they move deeper into the trailer to create a forced perspective and give the illusion that the trailer is larger than it looks. There were 2 additional details of the wainscoting that were not so straightforward. One was the gap for the round door there at the porch. Here I needed these 2 strangely shaped pieces, which I planned to wrap around the door. I created these pieces using my projection method. The other not so straightforward detail was the crown molding, which I had found in the Lowe's Victorian section. I had to learn how to do both a miter cut and a conforming cut to install the crown molding. This was the first batch of wood I bought since I purchased the wood for the floor at Ashby Lumber. Luckily at Lowe's, I found they had some nice wood that had no knots in it whatsoever. It was kind of pricey, but I thought it was worth it. They also had larger solid pine planks. Later, I noticed a sticker on one of the boards that said it was imported from New Zealand. And with my Tolkien-inspired design, it seemed appropriate to use this timber in the trailer. I used a construction method that my dad had recommended before he passed, called pocket holes, a technique that joins wood together using angled holes. Within it, I could conceal all the screws that held my woodwork together. You'll find this a lot in finely crafted furniture. In order to keep the wainscoting as square as possible, the plan was to build it first and then attach it to the trailer. Also, I decided the wainscoting would have a dark stain with a shellac final coat to give it a nice gloss. The last piece was a wider countertop sort of surface at the head of the bed. So at the end of August, with my family's help, we attached the wainscoting to the floor. At this point, I realized there was a lot of space between the head of the bed and the roof in the front of the trailer. I decided that would be a good place to put storage. Partly inspired by a bed my mom had when I was a child that had sliding doors in the headboard, and also by treehouse fort architecture, I thought this would be a good spot for some secret compartments. I had to pause my construction while I finished this design. It was so late in the year at this point, I started thinking about the coming rain.
In hindsight, I was rather naive about what I could get done before the rain set in. I started thinking about the roof. My brother had given me a small router table, and I had purchased 2 router bits that I thought would do the job. The router bits can cut a concave and a convex round edge on each board. I began experimenting with using the router. Next, I worked on building the arches for the 2 walls. This solved my design problem for needing to hold the wall boards together. You can see here with the arch clamped onto the trailer, I was starting to get the round hobbit shape I was after. It was early October now, and I pulled the trigger on purchasing the lumber for the walls, settling on a shiplap board with knots. 1 for the aesthetic, but 2, the knotty boards were cheaper. By mid-October, I'd made it up to my brother's, and together, we fed all the roof boards through a router, mounted in a table. In my research, I had seen this type of board shape used for hot tubs and canoes. The work was quite an arduous task, and a bit dangerous when the router slipped. It had now been a year since I'd started construction. Plowing along, I jumped in trying to figure out how I was going to make walls to match the model I had in my computer. Starting on one side, I used my projection method to cut out each piece to length so that it would match the arches I had created. At this point, I hit a proverbial wall, as it were. I tried to visualize several methods for construction, but I wasn't satisfied. My brother had advised that I needed some sort of waterproofing in the wall, so I added a layer of tar paper and 1/8-inch plywood to the plan. My hesitation was really about control. I felt the ideas that I was coming up with had too many variable factors. When trying to conceive of a method to build the walls, my mind latched around the idea of putting the walls all together first and then attaching it to the trailer. But building the walls separately and keeping the board square and true to my design never felt doable. I was working at the college during most of the time I was building the trailer. So I consulted the stage tech who was responsible for building all the sets for the theater productions at school. He suggested going back to basics and using the old trusted way of building, frame the house first, then add siding. Well, I had played with the aesthetic the interior of a wattle and daub house has. I thought of using an interior arch to give more structural strength, but I kind of ruled it out because of the weight it would add. Now, with inspiration and a path forward offered by my coworker, I went back to my computer model and started adding the arches back in, along with other interior woodwork, creating a frame to which I could attach the wallboards. At the end of 2022, after a pause of 3 months, I finally broke through the proverbial wall and added this wattle and daub faux woodwork onto the trailer. It consisted not only of the arches, but also a side post reinforcing where my round door would attach to the trailer. The weight of the round door caused some concern about parallelogramming. Also, I decided to add roof rafters and use what were intended to be shelf brackets as cross braces to keep the framework square. Around this time I got COVID, but I kept moving forward on the project, slowly. By mid-May, I installed the fully painted and wallpapered plywood on the driver's side. Here, if you look closely, are the first of 3 indirect lights I installed as well. One of the biggest challenges was cutting the hole in the wall for the window. I wanted the accuracy and control I had in the computer program, but never really felt I achieved that in the real world. In the end, by using my projection method, tracing, and just measuring and marking with a ruler, I got an acceptable hole that matched the window I bought. Thinking like a raindrop, as my dad called it, according to my brother, I devised a way to waterproof the window. Since the instructions that came with the windows were intended for 4-inch walls of a normal house, they didn't help much. In the beginning of June, I began screwing in the shiplap boards, all nicely stained, on top of the plywood walls. I decided to use house wrap instead of tar paper because it would be lighter. The passenger side wall with both the round door and the window were a little bit more tricky. I cut the door and window holes into the shiplap boards using my projection method. Next, I traced the holes in the plywood while it was held in place with temporary screws and a rather large number of clamps. I got to use a hand screw wood clamp that I got from my dad that he got from my uncle when he was his carpenter's apprentice. My uncle lived up the hill from me and worked in the area I live in now as a carpenter in the second half of the last century. Here I ran into the limits of my projection method. The tops of the boards on the driver's side wall didn't line up with the arch after being cut using the projection method. Whenever I needed shape boards to be an exact match on each side of the trailer, I used the projection method on one side and then traced the shape on the boards onto the other side for an exact match. The projection method was never accurate enough to match both sides. So I traced and cut the arch shape onto the top passenger side wall to match the driver's side. Next, I decided to stain the porch. I didn't like the look of the inside of the door frame of the round door. It consisted of several layers of construction. And I'd observed that when you get rough work at the edges, you cover it up with trim and it looks much nicer. I had purchased an electric bike with massive tires and noted they were about the same diameter as the door. So I decided to add a rubber seal around the door. I created the seal by purchasing a rubber inner tube that was just the right size. I installed it first with screws, but eventually glued it. Next, I installed the outside arches along with the last couple boards. I finally had 2 finished walls and was ready to do the roof. Now, the roof on my trailer is probably, some would say, the most innovative part of my design. Others might say controversial. And still others, like the physics lab tech at school, might say too many points of failure. The problem with using boards for a barrier that's supposed to be waterproof is that wood expands and contracts. I observed this in my floor. I used pipe clamps to make sure that when I screwed the floorboards in, there would be no gaps between the boards. Well, when I originally screwed them in, there weren't any gaps. But now coming up on 2 years later, after I had built the floor, there were definitely gaps. The boards had shrunk. To overcome this on the roof, I referred back to when I built my tree house, when I first became fascinated with rigging. At the time, I didn't want to nail the tree house directly to the tree, so I used straps to tie the tree house to the tree, which is a form of rigging. For the trailer roof, I made a plan to use steel cables and eye screws for what might be described as stitching the roof to the trailer. I turned my attention to how the eye screws would attach to each individual roof board. Referring back to Victorian architecture and the dental architectural features appearing on many a painted lady's roof, but also wanting to reinforce the bolts, I came up with a design I entitled a dent. I decided to use 1/2-inch pine to create the dents because that's the size of wood Lowe's sold. I was limited by both the supplies I could get and my ability to cut the pieces using the chop saw. I built a couple prototypes and installed them on one of my roof boards. I ended up buying a drill press to get them as accurate as possible, and I think it paid off because I got a very good fit. It was coming up on the anniversary of 2 years making the trailer, and I was again worried about the rain starting. But I really wanted to make it right, so I bought a trailer cover to go over the trailer, which eased the pressure to get the roof on. I was really worried about the interior of the walls with the wallpaper and the wainscoting finished with shellac, which isn't waterproof. There are 32 boards on the roof, each needing 2 dents, 1 on each side of the trailer. I had to stain them prior to assembly. We had a very wet year that winter, but I rigged a tarp over my garage and plowed forward. The roof was probably the most time-consuming process in the project. By the time 2023 rolled around, I had manufactured my 64 dentals. The next step was to stain the roof boards and start fitting them on the roof. I tried to place the boards that fit most tightly together on the top, where there was less slope,
and therefore waterproofing was more important. So one board at a time, I progressed installing the dents. And as the year turned to spring, my roof started to take shape and form. Before I buttoned it up, or more appropriately, sewed it up, I installed the third interior light I had planned. Next, I started on the back double doors. They're supposed to be like 5-panel doors, although they only have 4 panels, which I made exponentially larger from top to bottom. The doors are made in the traditional rail and style construction technique. I used 4-inch wide boards sandwiched together to build the frame, and floated plywood panels inside rabbet cuts, a construction term for a right-angled notch cut that runs the length of a corner of the board. After installing a doorknob on the right-hand door, I proceeded to hang the doors in the 2x4 frame at the back of the trailer. I was surprised how well the process went, considering that hanging doors is not my specialty. With that completed, I started realizing that the trailer was really gonna match my design. All of my ideas had been successfully rendered in real life. The last challenge in this respect was the round door. My design was more like a hatch. It was designed early on in the process when I was really fearful of my carpentry skills. So I built it like the doors we made on our forts when we were kids. In my design, the door was bigger than the door frame and covered it rather than being inside it. I designed a small intersection of the door that would fit inside the door frame, but with the weather protection of the bigger section covering the frame, I figured it not be a perfect fit. It was supposed to appear as a 6-panel door, which in my mind is the quintessential front door, but round. Square shapes are easy to create with wood. Round is not so easy. For the arches, I used large boards, cut out the curved shapes in smaller pieces, and then joined the 3 of them together to make the bigger shape. For the round door, I used a different method. As I said earlier, polygons in 3D modeling are easier to form into square shapes than round shapes, just like wood. So I decided to make the round shape of the door out of trapezoids, just the way my polygon model for the door was made out of trapezoids. I was able to print a picture of one trapezoid from my model to scale. From that paper trapezoid, I was able to produce wooden trapezoids of the same size, similar to how a stone arch is fitted together with small stones. After quite a bit of trial and error to get the size of trapezoids just right in the real world, and some tricky cuts to create the stiles and rails, I had a door. I took a break from the round door and installed the dummy doorknob on the left side back door. Next, I put in the back wall boards, finally enclosing the trailer. This was a disappointment to the neighborhood cat that liked to take afternoon naps in it. And then finally, I completed the most satisfying carpentry work of the project, installing a crem bolt to latch the left-hand door in place. As I said in my Facebook post, I decided to use a crem bolt early on in the planning stages because I thought it would give an old-timey feel, and I do believe it does. As I hit October, coming up on the 3rd anniversary of the build, I hung the round door and installed a cool doorknob I found online. Additionally, I installed the lantern taillights using the lanterns I'd received early in the project. I also attached a bumper made from 2 pine boards rather than a 2x4 because I felt it would be lighter and make it easier to recess the license plate and license plate lights into the bumper. These tasks were required to make the trailer roadworthy, and after completing this work, it was indeed ready to hit the road. On December 12, 2023, the trailer took its maiden voyage to Camp Taylor in Marin County. I had trouble sleeping because I was so excited, but it performed admirably. In January, I added a tree motif in the back, again using my projection method. This screenshot from Zelda might also give a glimpse from where I got my design inspiration. Making the trailer was a great experience. I loved being an architect, problem solving, creating,
But most important, I really just liked the work. I realized that my dad was really a workaholic. I remember spending Christmas with him the year before he passed. I thought we would have a leisurely visit together. We ended up redoing his floors. That was his idea of a good time. And actually, talking to him as we worked together was probably more bonding than binging a TV show with him on the couch. So I think I agree with him. Making the trailer kept my mind and my hands busy and gave me a goal to achieve every day. After losing my father, it was great therapy, very cathartic, and a way to connect with my father's spirit, which I hope I have captured in the enrapture that this here trailer creates. Thank you for watching.